Anne Boleyn woke up on May 1st, 1536, as Queen of England. By sunset, she was watching men being dragged from the palace in chains, accused of sleeping with her. Things she never imagined would happen were unfolding at a speed that made her head spin. The day started normally enough. A May Day tournament at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, her husband, sat beside her in the royal box. Knights jousted below, their lances splintering against shields. The crowd roared. Anne smiled and waved, playing her role as queen. She had no idea these were her last hours of freedom. Then something shifted. During the tournament, Anne dropped her handkerchief. A small gesture, traditional even. Henry Norris, one of the king's closest friends and a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, picked it up and returned it to her with a bow. That was it. Just a handkerchief. Henry's face changed, his jaw clenched. His eyes went dark. Without a word, he stood up and left the tournament. Just walked away, leaving Anne sitting there confused and increasingly terrified. The crowd noticed. Whispers started. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Anne tried to follow him, but guards stopped her. The king had retired to his chambers and did not wish to be disturbed, not even by his wife. She stood in the corridor, her stomach twisting into knots. Henry had been distant lately, especially since her miscarriage in January. But this was different. This felt dangerous. That night, while Anne paced her rooms trying to understand what had happened, Mark Smeaton was being arrested. Smeaton was a musician at court, talented but low-born. He played the virginals beautifully and had risen in favor through his musical gifts. Anne had been kind to him, as she was to most artists at court. She had no idea that kindness would be used to destroy her. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, had Smeaton taken to his house in Stepney, not to the Tower, not officially arrested, just brought in for questioning. Cromwell was methodical, calculating. He knew exactly what he needed, a confession, and he knew how to get it. The torture started almost immediately. The rack was the weapon of choice. Smeaton's arms and legs were stretched slowly, joint by joint, until the pain became unbearable. Cromwell stood nearby, asking the same questions over and over. Did Smeaton have relations with the Queen? How many times? Where? When? Smeaton held out for hours. He screamed that it wasn't true, that he had never touched the Queen, that their conversations were innocent. But the rack kept turning. His shoulders began to dislocate. The pain became so intense that his mind started to fragment. Finally, sometime after midnight, Smeaton broke. He confessed to adultery with Queen Anne. Once, he said. Maybe twice. The details were vague because they were invented, but Cromwell didn't care about details. He cared about the confession itself. Once he had Smeaton's signed statement, the machinery of destruction could begin. Anne didn't know any of this yet. She spent that night unable to sleep, troubled by Henry's strange behavior, but not yet understanding the magnitude of what was coming. She had survived plenty of Henry's moods before. She assumed this was another one. She was catastrophically wrong. May 2nd began with more arrests. Before dawn, royal guards appeared at the lodgings of Henry Norris. Norris, who had served Henry faithfully for years, was dragged from his bed and taken directly to the Tower of London. No explanation, no charges read. Just chains and a boat ride down the Thames to England's most feared prison. William Brereton was next, then Francis Weston, both gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber, both arrested within hours of each other. All three men had one thing in common. They had been friendly with Queen Anne. They had danced with her at court functions. They had made her laugh. They had been part of her circle. In Henry VIII's increasingly paranoid mind, guided by Cromwell's manipulation, these innocent interactions became evidence of a massive conspiracy. Anne wasn't just unfaithful, she was a traitor who had cuckolded the king with multiple men, making a mockery of his manhood and threatening the succession with bastard children. The speed of it all was breathtaking. Less than 48 hours after that, dropped handkerchief, 4 men were in the Tower of London, facing charges of adultery with the Queen. And Anne still didn't know, She found out around noon on May the 2nd. She was at Greenwich Palace, in her private apartments, when members of the Privy Council arrived. Their faces were stone. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, was among them. So was Cromwell. They informed Anne that she was under investigation for adultery. Multiple counts, with multiple men, including commoners. The charges were so absurd that Anne actually laughed. She thought it must be some kind of test, some political game she didn't understand yet. Then Cromwell showed her Smeaton's confession. Anne's laughter died. Her face went white. She grabbed the document with shaking hands and read the words. The musician she had been kind to had confessed to sleeping with her. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was there in writing, signed and sealed. Anne's mind raced. If they had tortured a confession out of Smeaton, what else were they willing to fabricate? Who else had they arrested? What was Henry thinking? She demanded to see the king. She demanded to speak to her husband and clear up this misunderstanding. The council members exchanged glances. There would be no meeting with the king. Anne was to be taken to the Tower of London immediately. For her own protection, they said, while the investigation proceeded. She was not technically under arrest, not yet, but she was certainly not free. Anne's world collapsed in that moment. The Tower wasn't just a prison. It was where traitors went to die. Her mother's family, the Howards, had lost members there. Anne herself had witnessed executions from the Tower walls during her years at court. Everyone knew what the Tower meant. She begged, she pleaded. She invoked her status as queen, her marriage to Henry, her daughter Elizabeth. Nothing worked. The men standing before her had already made their decision, or rather, Henry had made it for them. Anne Boleyn was going to the Tower, and she was going now. Within the hour, Anne was being escorted through the palace corridors. Servants and courtiers lined the walls, watching in shocked silence as their queen was led away like a common criminal. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked away, already distancing themselves from a woman who was clearly falling from grace. The journey to the Tower was made by royal barge down the Thames, the same river route Anne had taken during her coronation procession just 3 years earlier. Then, the banks had been lined with cheering crowds. Cannons had fired in celebration. Now, the journey was silent except for the splash of oars in the water. Anne sat in the barge, her mind spinning with terror and disbelief. 2 days ago, she had been Queen of England, secure in her position, focused on bearing Henry another child. Now she was headed to the Tower under suspicion of adultery and treason. The shift was so sudden, so complete, that her brain couldn't process it. As the barge approached the Tower's watergate, Anne saw the fortress looming above her. The thick stone walls, the narrow windows, the ravens circling overhead. This was Traitor's Gate, the entrance where prisoners of the crown were brought in from the river. Anne had never imagined she would enter through this gate. When the barge docked, Anne had to be helped out. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, was waiting for her. His face showed no emotion. He had seen plenty of high-born prisoners pass through these gates. Queens were new, but the process was the same. Anne was led through the gate and into the Tower complex. With each step, her panic increased. She kept asking questions that nobody answered. What were the exact charges? When could she see the king? When would this be sorted out? The silence was worse than any answer could have been. They brought her to the royal apartments within the Tower, technically comfortable lodgings, the same rooms she had stayed in before her coronation. But now the doors were locked from the outside. Guards were posted. Anne was a prisoner in rooms that should have been her sanctuary. As night fell on May 2nd, Anne Boleyn sat alone in her chamber, trying to understand how her life had imploded in just 48 hours. 4 men were already imprisoned because of her. More arrests were surely coming. And somewhere in London, her husband was making plans she couldn't even imagine. But if Anne thought the worst was over, she was about to learn a brutal lesson. The nightmare hadn't even really started yet. The first night in the Tower of London broke something fundamental in Anne Boleyn's mind. The rooms were the same ones she had occupied before her coronation, when everything was celebration and triumph. Now those same walls felt like a tomb. Anne couldn't sleep. She paced the chambers for hours, her brain spinning through endless scenarios. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, some political maneuver she didn't grasp yet. Henry couldn't actually believe she had committed adultery. They had been married for 3 years. She was the mother of his child. She was his wife, his queen, the woman he had broken with Rome to marry. But as dawn broke on May 3rd, reality began to sink in. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional, calculated. Cromwell had orchestrated it, certainly, but Henry had approved it. Her husband wanted her in the Tower. The man she had loved, the man she had destroyed her reputation for, the man she had given everything to, had decided she was disposable. The realization hit Anne like a physical blow. She started crying and couldn't stop. Not delicate tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal. The guards outside her door heard everything. They would later testify about the Queen's breakdown, describing how she alternated between hysterical weeping and manic laughter, because once the crying stopped, the laughter started. Dark, unhinged laughter at the absurdity of it all. Anne had clawed her way to the throne. She had waited years for Henry to divorce Catherine of Aragon. She had resisted becoming his mistress, holding out for marriage. She had endured the hatred of half the kingdom who saw her as a homewrecker and a whore. And now, after all that, she was being accused of the very promiscuity she had spent years avoiding. The irony was so cruel, it felt like a cosmic joke. Anne laughed until she couldn't breathe, until her sides ached, until the guards actually opened the door to check if she was all right. When they saw her face, tear-streaked and wild-eyed, they quickly retreated. The Queen of England was losing her mind, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, visited Anne that morning. He was trying to be kind, within the constraints of his duty. He explained that she was being held while investigations proceeded. The charges were serious. Adultery with multiple men, which for a queen constituted high treason. Treason against the King's Majesty. Treason against the crown. Treason against the succession. Anne tried to defend herself. She told Kingston the charges were insane, that she had never been unfaithful, that Mark Smeaton must have been tortured into confessing. Kingston listened politely but offered no reassurances. He had seen plenty of prisoners protest their innocence. Most of them still ended up dead. What Kingston did tell Anne, perhaps out of pity, was the scope of the arrests. Mark Smeaton had confessed. Henry Norris was in the Tower. William Brereton and Francis Weston were imprisoned, and there was more coming. The investigation was expanding. More names were being added. Anne's mind seized on one terrifying possibility. Her brother. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was one of her closest allies at court. He was Henry's friend too, or had been. If Cromwell was looking to destroy Anne completely, George would be an obvious target. Taking down Anne's brother would eliminate any remaining Boleyn power at court. She asked Kingston directly, had her brother been arrested? Kingston hesitated, which told Anne everything she needed to know. George hadn't been arrested yet, but it was coming. She could see it in Kingston's face. The trap was closing around her entire family. Anne's panic intensified. She started talking compulsively, unable to stop the words pouring out. Kingston would later report that the Queen talked so much he could barely keep track of everything she said. She rambled about her innocence, about her marriage, about conversations she'd had with the arrested men. Every word she spoke, Kingston dutifully recorded, and every word would later be used against her. In her desperate state, Anne made a fatal mistake. She started trying to explain away innocent interactions, not realizing that her explanations only gave Cromwell more material to twist. She mentioned joking with Henry Norris about marriage. She recalled conversations with Francis Weston. She remembered moments of laughter and teasing that had seemed harmless at the time. Kingston wrote it all down. Later, Cromwell would take Anne's own words, her frantic attempts to prove her innocence, and transformed them into evidence of guilt. A joke about marriage became evidence of planning the king's death. Laughter with a courtier became evidence of inappropriate intimacy. Anne was unknowingly building her own prosecution case with every panicked word. By mid-morning on May 3rd, Anne's worst fear was confirmed. George Boleyn was arrested, charged with adultery and incest with his own sister. The accusation was so grotesque, so obviously fabricated, that it should have been laughed out of any courtroom. Brother-sister incest was one of the most serious taboos in Tudor England. Even Cromwell's allies thought the charge was excessive. But excessive was the point. Henry didn't just want Anne removed. He wanted her destroyed so completely that no one would ever question his right to be rid of her. Incest was the ultimate taboo, the one crime that would make Anne seem irredeemably evil. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. It didn't matter that the charge was biologically absurd. What mattered was the horror it would provoke. When Anne learned that George had been arrested and what he was charged with, she had a complete psychological collapse. The guards reported that she screamed for nearly an hour straight. Not words, just raw sound, the noise of a human mind breaking under pressure it was never meant to withstand. Her brother, her own brother, the one person in her family she actually trusted, the one ally she thought she had left. Now he was in the Tower too, facing execution for a crime that existed only in Cromwell's imagination. Anne understood in that moment that this wasn't about justice or truth. This was about erasure. Henry wanted the Boleyns wiped off the map. The isolation in the Tower was its own form of torture. Anne was given ladies-in-waiting, but they weren't her friends. They were spies, placed there by Cromwell to monitor everything she said and did. Anne knew they were reporting back. She could see it in their faces, the way they watched her constantly, the way they exchanged glances when she spoke. She tried to be careful, to control what she said, but the pressure was too much. Anne had always been articulate, witty, quick with words. Now that verbal agility became a liability. She couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop trying to explain, couldn't stop analyzing every past interaction for clues about how this had happened. The ladies-in-waiting dutifully reported everything. Anne's jokes, her fears, her prayers, her bitter comments about Henry's cruelty. All of it went into reports that made their way to Cromwell's desk. He read them carefully, looking for anything he could use. Anne's own words, spoken in moments of terror and desperation, became weapons in his hands. Sleep became impossible. Anne would lie in bed for hours, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Henry would come to his senses. Maybe he would realize this was all Cromwell's manipulation. Maybe he still loved her, somewhere underneath the rage and paranoia. Maybe this was just a scare tactic, a way to remind her of her place, and soon she'd be released, and everything would go back to normal. But even as Anne tried to cling to these desperate hopes, another part of her brain knew the truth. She had seen how Henry discarded Catherine of Aragon. She had watched him destroy anyone who opposed his will. She knew what he was capable of when he wanted something or someone gone. And now she was the obstacle. She was the wife who had failed to give him sons, the queen who had become an embarrassment, the woman he needed to eliminate to move on to Jane Seymour. The cruelest part was that Anne had no real idea what Jane Seymour even looked like in detail. She was some pale, quiet girl from a minor noble family. Not particularly beautiful, not particularly accomplished. But she was new, and she was potentially fertile. And she represented hope to a king who had lost faith in his current wife. Anne had been replaced before she was even removed. On the evening of May 3rd, 2 days into her imprisonment, Anne sat in her chamber and faced the full weight of her situation. 5 men were in the Tower because of her. Her brother was charged with incest. She was accused of adultery, treason, and conspiracy to murder the king. The entire court had turned against her. Her own family had abandoned her. And Henry, the man she had loved and married and given everything for, wanted her dead. The walls of the Tower seemed to close in. Anne started having trouble breathing. Her chest tightened. Her vision narrowed. She was having what we would now recognize as a severe panic attack, but in 1536 it just felt like dying. She clutched her chest and gasped for air, while her ladies-in-waiting watched with a mixture of concern and professional detachment. This was only the beginning. Anne Boleyn had survived the dangerous waters of Henry's court for years through intelligence, charm, and political skill. But those tools were useless now. She was trapped in the Tower, waiting for a trial she knew would be rigged, facing charges she knew were false, dependent on the mercy of a husband who had already decided she deserved none. The nightmare that had started 2 days ago was deepening into something far worse than Anne had imagined possible. And the truly terrifying part was that she still had no idea how much worse it was going to get. 9 days passed in the Tower. 9 days of Anne deteriorating mentally and physically. She barely ate. She couldn't sleep more than an hour or two at a time. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she spent hours staring at the walls, occasionally breaking into sudden fits of weeping or manic speech. The waiting was its own torture. On May 12th, the waiting ended. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton were tried at Westminster Hall. Anne wasn't present for their trial, but she heard about it immediately afterward. The verdict had been predetermined. All 4 men were found guilty of adultery with the Queen and sentenced to death. The evidence against them was laughable. Smeaton's confession, obtained through torture, vague testimony from courtiers about seeing the men alone with Anne at various times, twisted interpretations of innocent conversations, no physical evidence, no witnesses to actual adultery, nothing concrete. It didn't matter. The jury, composed of men who owed their positions to Henry VIII, voted unanimously for conviction. Anne's own trial was scheduled for May 15th. 3 days to prepare a defense against charges she couldn't fully understand because they were based on fabrications. She asked for legal counsel. The request was denied. Queens didn't get lawyers. She asked to see the specific evidence against her. Also denied. She would hear the charges when she stood trial, not before. The location chosen for Anne's trial was the Great Hall in the Tower of London. Not Westminster, where nobles were usually tried. The symbolism was clear. Anne was already a prisoner, and the trial would happen on prison grounds. She would walk from her cell to the courtroom and then back to her cell to await execution. The route was short because the outcome was inevitable. On the morning of May 15th, Anne was escorted from her apartments to the Great Hall. She wore a black gown with a white cape. Her hair was concealed under a headdress. She looked thin and exhausted, but she held her head up. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with as much dignity as she could maintain. The Great Hall had been transformed into a courtroom. Tiered seating had been constructed to accommodate the roughly 2,000 spectators who had been granted permission to watch. This was theater as much as justice. Henry wanted everyone to see Anne's humiliation. He wanted the world to witness her downfall and to understand that he was the wronged party, not her. 26 peers of the realm sat as Anne's judges. At their head was her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The irony was vicious. Norfolk had risen in power largely because of Anne's success. His family owed their prominence to her marriage to Henry. Now he would preside over her destruction without hesitation. Norfolk showed no emotion as Anne entered. Neither did any of the other judges. They sat in their robes and chains of office, their faces carefully neutral. Anne looked at each of them, searching for even a hint of sympathy or doubt. She found nothing. These men had already decided. This trial was just a performance. The charges were read aloud. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and her own brother George Boleyn. She was accused of inciting these men to adultery through her words and behavior. She was accused of conspiracy to murder King Henry VIII so she could marry one of her lovers. She was accused of saying she would marry Norris if the king died, which constituted imagining the king's death, which was treason. Anne listened to the charges with visible disbelief. The accusations were so extreme, so disconnected from reality, that they seemed like fiction. She had imagined the king's death. She had planned to murder her husband. She had committed incest with George. Each charge was more absurd than the last. When invited to respond, Anne spoke clearly and firmly. She denied every charge. She had never been unfaithful to Henry. She had never encouraged any man to commit adultery with her. She had never plotted against the king's life. The conversations cited as evidence were innocent remarks twisted beyond recognition. A joke about marriage was just that, a joke. Laughter with friends was not evidence of sexual intimacy. Anne was eloquent. She defended herself point by point, addressing each accusation with logic and reason. She pointed out the impossibility of some of the alleged encounters. She noted that several of the supposed adultery dates were times when she was pregnant or recovering from childbirth, hardly ideal circumstances for secret affairs. She challenged the credibility of testimony obtained through torture. It didn't matter. The judges sat stone-faced. The prosecution, led by Cromwell's people, didn't even bother to seriously rebut Anne's arguments. They didn't need to. This wasn't a real trial. This was a ritual of condemnation dressed up in legal procedure. The most damning evidence against Anne was her own words, recorded by Kingston and the ladies-in-waiting during her 9 days in the Tower. Anne's panicked explanations of innocent interactions had been twisted into confessions. Her attempts to contextualize her relationships with the accused men became evidence that those relationships were inappropriate. Cromwell had been brilliant in his manipulation. He had used Anne's intelligence against her, her verbal agility, her tendency to explain and justify, her desperate need to make people understand her innocence. All of it had been weaponized. Every word she spoke in the Tower had been catalogued and distorted until it supported the prosecution's narrative. The trial lasted several hours. Anne stood for the entire proceeding, maintaining her composure even as it became increasingly clear that her defense was pointless. The spectators watched with morbid fascination. Some were sympathetic. Most were simply curious to see how a queen behaved when facing death. When the evidence had been presented and the arguments made, the judges retired to deliberate. They were gone less than an hour. The speed told Anne everything she needed to know. They had decided before the trial even started. The deliberation was just for show. When the judges returned, Norfolk stood to deliver the verdict. He looked directly at his niece and pronounced her guilty on all charges. Every single judge voted for conviction. 26 peers of England unanimously agreed that Anne Boleyn had committed adultery and treason. The sentence was death, in a manner to be determined by the king, either burning at the stake or beheading. Anne's face went white. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that anticipation couldn't match. Burning or beheading. Those were her options, death by fire or death by blade. Her husband, the man who had once written her love letters and broken with Rome to marry her, would decide which form of execution she deserved. Anne found her voice. She addressed the court one final time. She protested her innocence again. She said she was prepared to die, but she grieved that innocent men were also condemned to death because of false charges against her. She asked God to save the king and grant him a long reign. Even in the face of her own death sentence, Anne was careful not to openly criticize Henry. She knew that any bitter words would be used as justification for more cruelty, possibly toward her daughter Elizabeth. Then Anne was led out of the great hall. The spectators watched in silence as she walked back toward her apartments. Her trial had lasted less than a day. Her conviction had been assured before it even began. And now she was officially a condemned traitor, waiting for her husband to decide exactly how she would die. But Anne's trial wasn't the end of the day's horrors. That same afternoon, George Boleyn faced his own trial in the same hall. The courtroom had barely been cleared of spectators from Anne's trial before new crowds filed in to watch her brother's destruction. George's trial was even more grotesque than Anne's. The incest charge was the centerpiece, a crime so shocking that merely stating it aloud was meant to convince people of his guilt. The evidence was non-existent. The prosecution relied entirely on innuendo and circumstantial observations. George and Anne were close siblings who spent time together. They had private conversations. They laughed together. Therefore, they must have committed incest. George defended himself brilliantly. He was articulate, educated, and quick-witted. He systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, pointing out the absence of any real evidence. He challenged his accusers to produce a single witness who had seen anything inappropriate. He noted that siblings spending time together was normal, not criminal. During the trial, the prosecution made a critical error. They handed George a piece of paper with a question written on it, instructing him not to read it aloud. The question was whether Anne had told George that Henry was impotent, unable to properly perform sexually. This was devastating information if made public, suggesting that any of Anne's children might not be Henry's biological offspring. George, either through desperation or defiance, read the question aloud anyway. The courtroom erupted. Henry's sexual inadequacy was now a matter of public record. The king's masculinity, already damaged by accusations that his wife preferred other men, was further humiliated by the suggestion that he couldn't satisfy her in the first place. This sealed George's fate. Even if the judges had harbored any doubts about his guilt, publicly humiliating the king was unforgivable. George Boleyn was found guilty and sentenced to death. Like his sister, he would die for crimes he never committed. Anne heard about George's conviction within hours. Her brother was condemned. 5 men total would die because of charges connected to her. Mark Smeaton, who confessed under torture, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton, who maintained their innocence but were convicted anyway, and George, her own brother, condemned for the crime of being related to her. That night, back in her Tower apartments, Anne finally stopped crying. The tears had run out. The panic had burned itself out. What remained was a kind of hollow acceptance. She was going to die. Her brother was going to die. 5 men she had known and been kind to were going to die, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop any of it. The trial had been a circus, a performance designed to give legal cover to murder. The verdict had been written before the first witness testified. The judges had condemned her before hearing her defense. Justice had nothing to do with what happened in that courtroom. This was about Henry's wounded pride, Cromwell's political ambitions, and the expendability of women who failed to produce male heirs. Anne Boleyn had gone from queen to convicted traitor in less than 2 weeks. The speed of her fall was shocking even by Tudor standards. But the truly horrifying part was that her ordeal wasn't over. The trial was finished, but the executions hadn't started yet. Anne would have to watch the men condemned with her die first. She would have to live with the knowledge that her existence had caused their deaths. And then, when they were all gone, it would finally be her turn. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was about to get significantly worse. Anne woke on May 17th to the sound of hammering. The noise came from Tower Hill, just outside the walls of her prison. She knew immediately what it meant. They were building the scaffold. The executions were today. For 2 days since her trial, Anne had existed in a state of numb horror. The verdict had been delivered. Death was certain. But hearing the scaffold being constructed made it visceral in a way that nothing else had. Those wooden planks being nailed together were the platform where men would die because of her. The condemned men were Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn. 5 executions scheduled for the same morning. Henry wanted this done quickly and efficiently. No drawn-out process. No time for public sympathy to build. Just rapid elimination of everyone connected to Anne's alleged crimes. Anne asked her ladies-in-waiting if she would be forced to watch. They didn't know, or wouldn't say. She was kept in her apartments, but the windows faced Tower Hill. If she looked out, she would see everything. If she stayed away from the windows, she would still hear the crowds, the reading of the charges, the fall of the axe. Around 9 in the morning, the condemned men were brought out. Anne heard the crowd noise increase. She stood frozen in the middle of her chamber, trying to decide whether to look or not. Her curiosity and her horror fought each other. Finally, unable to stop herself, she moved to the window. The scaffold was clearly visible from her position. A raised wooden platform with steps leading up to it. The execution block sat in the center, a low piece of wood where the condemned would kneel and place their necks. Next to it stood the executioner, an axe in his hands. Around the scaffold, hundreds of spectators had gathered. Executions were public events, entertainment for the masses. The first man brought up to the scaffold was Mark Smeaton. Anne could barely see his face from this distance, but she recognized his slight build. Smeaton was given the chance to speak. This was tradition. The condemned made a final statement, usually professing loyalty to the king and accepting their fate as God's will. Smeaton spoke briefly. Anne couldn't hear his exact words, but she later learned what he said. He confessed again to adultery with the Queen. Even at the moment of his death, facing God's judgment, Smeaton maintained the lie that torture had forced from him. Perhaps he thought it would help his family. Perhaps the torture had broken something in his mind that couldn't be fixed. Either way, his false confession persisted until the end. Then Smeaton knelt at the block. The executioner raised the axe. Anne turned away from the window just before it fell, but she heard the sound. The thud of metal on wood, on bone. The roar of the crowd. She heard it clearly. Mark Smeaton was dead. Anne vomited. The ladies-in-waiting rushed to help her, but there was nothing they could do. Anne knelt on the floor, retching, her body rejecting the horror of what was happening. A man had just died because of her, because of lies about her. His blood was on the scaffold because Cromwell needed a confession and Smeaton was vulnerable enough to break. Before Anne could recover, the next execution began. Henry Norris was brought to the scaffold. Norris had been one of Henry's closest friends. He had served the king faithfully for years. His loyalty had meant nothing when Cromwell needed bodies to pile up against Anne. Norris made his final speech. Unlike Smeaton, Norris refused to confess. He maintained his innocence to the end. He said he was dying unjustly, but he forgave those who had wronged him and trusted in God's mercy. His dignity was intact even as he placed his neck on the block. The axe fell. Another thud. Another roar from the crowd. Henry Norris was gone. Anne was crying now, deep sobs that shook her entire body. Her ladies-in-waiting stood nearby, uncertain what to do. They were supposed to monitor Anne's behavior and report back to Cromwell. But what was there to report? That the Queen was devastated watching men die for crimes they didn't commit. That she was collapsing under the weight of guilt and grief. These things were obvious to anyone with eyes. Francis Weston was next. He was young, maybe in his late 20s. He had a wife and children. His family's future was destroyed by his conviction. They would lose everything: property, status, security. Weston's death meant his family's ruin. And for what? Because he had danced with Anne at court functions, because he had made her laugh, because Cromwell needed more names for the indictment. Weston died quickly. The executioner was experienced. The axe was sharp. One blow was enough. Anne heard it even though she had moved away from the window. She sat on the floor with her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds. The thud of the axe, the crowd's reaction, the horrible finality of each death. William Brereton followed. He was older, more established at court. His execution was particularly pointless. The evidence against him was so thin that even the prosecution had struggled to make a case. But he was part of Anne's circle, and that was enough. Cromwell's strategy was to cast such a wide net that Anne seemed surrounded by lovers. 5 men suggested systematic promiscuity. 1 or 2 men might have been dismissed as rumor or mistake. But 5 made Anne look irredeemably corrupt. Brereton maintained his innocence like Norris. He used his final words to protest the injustice being done. It didn't matter. The crowd was there for spectacle, not truth. They wanted blood and drama. Brereton's death gave them both. 4 men dead. 4 bodies lying on the scaffold, their heads severed from their bodies. 4 families destroyed. 4 lives ended for nothing. and one more execution remained. The worst one. The one that Anne had been dreading most of all. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was brought to the scaffold. Anne's brother, the person she had trusted most at court, her ally in the brutal world of Henry's politics. Now he was climbing the steps to his death, condemned for the crime of being her sibling. George's speech was the longest. He was an educated man, articulate and thoughtful. He used his final moments to reflect on his life. He admitted to sins. He had lived indulgently. He had been prideful. He had strayed from God's path in various ways. But he denied the crime he was condemned for. He said plainly that he had never committed incest with his sister. He said he was dying because of false testimony and judicial murder. Then George made a request that cut Anne to her core. He asked the crowd to pray for the king, that he might have wise counsel going forward. It was a subtle accusation. George was implying that Henry had been led astray by bad advisers. He was pointing to Cromwell without naming him directly. His final words were an indictment of the system that was killing him. George knelt at the block. Anne watched from the window this time. She couldn't look away. This was her brother. She owed him the dignity of witnessing his death, no matter how much it destroyed her. She stood at the window with tears streaming down her face as George Boleyn placed his neck on the blood-stained block. The executioner raised the axe. Anne's vision blurred with tears, but she kept watching. The axe fell. George's head separated from his body. He died instantly. The crowd roared their approval. Another traitor eliminated. Another show completed. Entertainment delivered. Anne collapsed. She didn't faint, but her legs gave out and she crumpled to the floor. The sound that came from her throat was inhuman. Grief and guilt and horror compressed into a wail that echoed through her apartments. Her brother was dead. George was gone. Killed for being related to her. Executed for a crime so absurd that nobody with sense could have believed it. And she had watched it happen. The ladies-in-waiting helped Anne to her bed. She was shaking violently, her body in shock. They tried to get her to drink wine or eat something, but she couldn't. Her mind was trapped in an endless loop. 5 men dead, 5 executions, 5 families destroyed, and it was all connected to her. The executions had taken about 2 hours total. By noon, all 5 bodies had been removed from the scaffold. The heads were displayed on spikes as warnings to others. The bodies were taken away for burial in unmarked graves. It was over. The preliminaries were complete. The supporting cast had been eliminated. Now there was just Anne, the main attraction. The Queen condemned to death. Her execution had been scheduled, then delayed, then rescheduled. The uncertainty was its own torture. Anne knew she was going to die. She just didn't know when. Tomorrow? Next week? Would Henry make her wait longer? Would he show some final mercy and commute her sentence? That night, Anne lay in bed unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scaffold. She saw George kneeling at the block. She heard the thud of the axe. The sounds and images played on repeat in her mind. She had witnessed judicial murder. She had watched innocent men die, and she knew her turn was coming. The psychological damage was complete. Anne Boleyn's mind had been systematically destroyed over the course of 17 days. The shock of arrest, the horror of false charges, the betrayal of her family, the mockery of her trial, and now the trauma of watching 5 men executed for crimes that never happened. But Henry wasn't done with her yet. There was still more cruelty to inflict, more humiliation to impose. The executions Anne had witnessed were just preparation for her own death. And when that death finally came, it would reveal just how thoroughly Henry VIII had learned to discard the women who failed him. Anne Boleyn woke on May 18th, knowing she had less than 24 hours to live. Her execution had been scheduled for the morning of May 19th. 17 days after her arrest, she would be dead. The speed was breathtaking, from queen to corpse in just over 2 weeks. The night after the 5 executions had been the worst of Anne's life. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw George's head separating from his body. She heard the thud of the axe. The images played on an endless loop in her mind. Her brother was dead. 5 men were dead, and she was next. Morning brought a strange clarity. The waiting was over. The uncertainty had ended. Anne knew exactly when she would die, and roughly how. Henry had shown her one small mercy. Instead of burning at the stake, which was the traditional punishment for treasonous queens, he had commuted her sentence to beheading. She would die by the sword, not by fire. It was a kindness, relatively speaking. But it was still death. Anne asked to see a priest. She wanted to take communion one final time. She wanted to confess her sins and receive absolution before facing God's judgment. The request was granted. A chaplain arrived at her apartments and heard her confession. What Anne said to the priest remained private, protected by the seal of confession. But after receiving communion, Anne did something extraordinary. She called for the consecrated host to be brought to her, and then, with the body of Christ literally present, she swore an oath. She swore on her salvation, on her hope of heaven, on everything holy, that she was innocent of the crimes for which she was condemned. This was the most serious oath a Christian could make. To swear falsely in the presence of the Eucharist was to damn your immortal soul. Anne was telling anyone who would listen that she was truly innocent. If she was lying, she was condemning herself to eternal hellfire. The chaplain who witnessed this oath was shaken. He later reported that Anne seemed sincere, desperate to make people understand that she was dying for crimes she never committed. But Anne's protestation of innocence wouldn't change anything. Henry had already moved on. While Anne was taking communion and swearing oaths in the Tower, the king was at Westminster planning his next wedding. Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet girl who had replaced Anne in Henry's affections, was being prepared for her role as the next queen. Dresses were being fitted. Arrangements were being made. Henry was eager to marry again immediately after Anne's execution. The speed of Henry's replacement plan was staggering. Anne wasn't even dead yet, and her successor was already being groomed. It was as if Anne had never mattered at all. 3 years of marriage erased. A daughter declared illegitimate. The woman Henry had pursued for years, had broken with Rome for, had crowned as his queen. She was being discarded like trash. Anne spent much of May 18th trying to prepare for death. This was harder than it sounds. How do you prepare to have your head cut off? How do you ready yourself for the moment when steel severs your neck? Anne's mind kept getting caught on the physical details. Would it hurt? How long would it take? Would she remain conscious after the blade fell? The questions were morbid, but unavoidable. The method of execution had been chosen carefully. Henry had imported a master swordsman from Calais, an expert executioner who used a sword instead of the traditional English axe. The sword was supposed to be quicker, cleaner, more merciful. A single stroke would sever Anne's head from her body. At least that was the theory. Anne had seen enough botched executions to know that theory and practice didn't always align. She became obsessed with her neck. At one point, she remarked to her ladies-in-waiting that she had a little neck. It was almost a joke, except there was nothing funny about it. Anne was fixating on the body part that would be severed tomorrow. She put her hands around her throat, measuring its circumference, imagining how the blade would cut through skin and bone and muscle. The ladies-in-waiting were disturbed by this behavior. They reported everything to Kingston, who recorded it dutifully. Even in her final hours, Anne was being monitored. Her words, her actions, her emotional state, all documented for posterity. She had no privacy even in death's approach. As the day progressed, Anne's mood shifted wildly. She would be calm and resigned one moment, then panicked and terrified the next. She would pray quietly, then suddenly burst into manic laughter. Her mind was fracturing under the pressure. The human brain wasn't designed to process imminent violent death. Anne's was doing its best, but the cracks were showing. She tried to write letters, one to her daughter Elizabeth, though she knew Henry would never allow the child to receive it. One to her father, though Thomas Boleyn had abandoned her completely. The letters were attempts to leave some record of her innocence, some testimony that would outlive her execution. but words felt inadequate. What could she say that would matter after she was dead? Around midday, Kingston visited Anne. He was kind in his way, within the constraints of his duty as her jailer. He informed her that the execution would take place early the next morning. The swordsman from Calais had arrived and was prepared. Everything was ready. Anne would die at around 8 a.m. on May 19th, assuming no further delays. Anne asked Kingston about the technical details. Would there be a block? No, she would simply kneel upright. The swordsman preferred this method. Would she be blindfolded? Yes, if she wished. A cloth would be tied over her eyes so she wouldn't see the blade coming. Anne said yes. She wanted the blindfold. She didn't want to see her death approaching. Then Anne asked the question that had been haunting her. Would it hurt? Kingston hesitated. He didn't know how to answer. Theoretically, death would be instant. The blade would sever her spinal cord before her brain could register pain. But theory was one thing, reality was another. Kingston settled for saying that the executioner was very skilled. It would be as quick and painless as possible. Anne didn't look reassured. The afternoon dragged on. Hours felt like days. Anne tried to pray but couldn't focus. She tried to eat but had no appetite. She tried to sleep but her mind wouldn't shut off. Every moment brought her closer to morning, closer to the scaffold, closer to the blade. As evening approached, Anne began to prepare herself psychologically. She had to die well. This was crucial. In Tudor England, how you died mattered. A good death meant facing execution with courage, making a dignified final speech, showing no fear or anger. A bad death meant breaking down, cursing your executioners, dying in terror. Anne was determined to die well. If she couldn't control her fate, she could at least control how she faced it. She practiced her final speech. The words had to be chosen carefully. She couldn't criticize Henry directly. That would be used as justification for punishing her family or harming Elizabeth. She couldn't proclaim her innocence too loudly. That would suggest the king's justice was flawed. She had to strike a balance. Dignified but submissive. Sad but not angry. Accepting death while subtly suggesting she didn't deserve it. The final speech Anne settled on was a masterpiece of careful wording. She would say she came there to die according to law. Not that the law was just, simply that it was law. She would praise Henry as a gentle and merciful prince. The irony would be obvious to anyone with sense, but she couldn't say otherwise. She would commend her soul to God and ask the crowd to pray for her. Brief, dignified, non-confrontational. It was the best she could do under impossible circumstances. As night fell on May 18th, Anne's apartments grew quiet. The ladies in waiting prepared for bed. Guards stood outside the door. Anne sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the Tower grounds where she would die tomorrow morning. The scaffold had already been built on Tower Green, within the walls rather than on Tower Hill. This was unusual. Most executions were public spectacles outside the Tower. Anne's would be more private, witnessed only by selected officials and dignitaries. Anne wondered about this choice. Was it mercy, giving her a more private death? Or was it shame? Did Henry want fewer witnesses to his murder of the woman he had once loved? Either way, it didn't change the outcome. Private or public, Anne would be just as dead. Around midnight, Anne finally lay down in bed. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually overcame her. She dozed fitfully for a few hours, waking repeatedly from nightmares. In her dreams, the executioner's sword kept missing, kept requiring multiple strokes, kept failing to kill her cleanly. She would wake in terror, heart pounding, before realizing she was still alive, still breathing, still had a few more hours. The last hours before dawn were the hardest. Anne lay in bed, fully awake, watching the darkness outside her window gradually lighten. Somewhere in London, the sun was rising on her final day. Birds were singing, people were waking up and going about their normal routines, and Anne Boleyn was preparing to die. She rose from bed around 6 in the morning. There was no point in trying to sleep anymore. She called for her ladies-in-waiting to help her dress. She had chosen her outfit carefully. A dark gray damask gown with a low neckline and a crimson kirtle underneath. The low neckline would make the executioner's job easier. The red underneath symbolized martyrdom. Anne was making a statement even in her death clothes. Her hair was brushed and pinned up, then concealed under a white coif and a black hood. Every strand had to be tucked away. Nothing could interfere with the blade. Anne looked at herself in a mirror one final time. She looked pale and thin, her face showing every moment of the stress she'd endured. But her eyes were calm now. She had moved beyond panic into acceptance. Kingston arrived just before 8. It was time. Anne stood up, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door. The walk from her apartments to the scaffold on Tower Green was short, maybe 100 yards, the shortest and longest walk of Anne Boleyn's life. As she stepped out of her apartments into the morning air, Anne took a deep breath. The sky was clear. It was going to be a beautiful day. She would not live to see the sunset. 17 days after her arrest, 4 days after her trial, 1 day after watching 5 men die, Anne Boleyn was walking to her own execution. The final act of this nightmare was about to begin. The scaffold stood on Tower Green, a raised wooden platform that looked almost mundane in the morning light. Around it, roughly 1,000 spectators had gathered. Not the massive crowds that attended public executions, but still a significant audience. Lords, officials, foreign ambassadors, selected Londoners who had been granted entry to witness the death of a queen. Anne walked toward the scaffold escorted by Kingston and 4 ladies-in-waiting. Her steps were steady. She showed no outward fear, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The crowd watched in silence as she approached. Many had never seen a queen executed before. This was history unfolding in front of them. Anne climbed the steps to the scaffold. Once on the platform, she turned to face the crowd. This was her moment to make her final statement, the speech she had practiced yesterday, the carefully chosen words that might be her last testimony to the world. She spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across Tower Green. She said she had come there to die according to law, for by the law she was judged to die. Not that the judgment was correct, just that it was law. She praised King Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord, a statement so loaded with irony that some in the crowd must have struggled not to react. Gentle and sovereign, the man who had fabricated charges against her, who had murdered her brother, who was replacing her before she was cold. Anne continued. She said she would not accuse anyone or speak of the reasons she was there. She asked the people to pray for the king, saying he had always been good to her. Again, the irony was almost painful. Good to her. The king who was having her beheaded. Good. But Anne couldn't say otherwise. Any criticism would endanger Elizabeth, would be used to justify even more cruelty. So she praised the man murdering her. She ended by commending her soul to God and asking Jesus Christ to save her. Then she turned to her ladies-in-waiting and began to prepare for the actual execution. The ladies removed Anne's hood and coif, exposing her hair. They took her necklace and gave her a white cap to tie over her eyes as a blindfold. Anne removed her gown herself, standing in her red kirtle. The red was now visible to everyone. Blood-colored. Martyr's clothing. The symbolism was clear to anyone watching. Anne's hands shook as she tied the white cap around her eyes. This was the moment. Once she was blindfolded, once she knelt down, there was no going back. The next thing she would feel was the sword cutting through her neck. Or not feel it, if death came quickly enough. The executioner stood ready. He wore plain clothes, not the traditional hooded executioner's garb. He held a sword, not an axe. The blade was long and sharp, designed for exactly this purpose. He had done this many times before. He was an expert. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Anne knelt on the scaffold. Not at a block. There was no block. She simply knelt upright, positioning herself so her neck was exposed and accessible. She tucked the red kirtle around her legs for modesty. Even in death, even blind and kneeling before an executioner's blade, Anne was aware of how she appeared to the watching crowd. She began to pray aloud. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. She repeated this prayer over and over, her voice steady but intense. This was how she would face death, praying, focused on salvation, trying to exit this world with her faith intact. The executioner had a problem. His method required distraction. He needed Anne to turn her head slightly, to expose her neck from the right angle. But if she saw or heard him approaching, she might flinch, might move, might make the stroke less clean. So he had developed a technique. As Anne knelt praying, the executioner called out loudly, "Bring me the sword!" He shouted to an assistant who was nowhere near the sword. It was a trick, a way to make Anne turn her head toward the voice, away from where the executioner actually stood. Anne heard the call. Still blindfolded, still praying, she turned her head slightly toward the sound. Just a small movement. Just enough. The executioner swung. The blade cut through Anne Boleyn's neck in a single stroke. Her head separated from her body cleanly. Death was instant. Her spinal cord severed, her brainstem destroyed before any pain signals could register. The expert swordsman had done his job perfectly. Anne's head fell to one side of the scaffold. Her body slumped forward, blood pouring from the neck wound. The crowd gasped. Some looked away. Others stared in fascination. They had just witnessed the execution of the Queen of England. History had been made, in high. The ladies in waiting moved forward quickly. They picked up Anne's head and body, wrapping them in white cloths. This was where the final grotesque horror revealed itself. No one had prepared a coffin. After all the elaborate planning, all the careful scheduling, all the attention to legal detail and public spectacle, nobody had bothered to arrange a proper coffin for Anne Boleyn's remains. It was an oversight so massive it seemed almost intentional. A final insult. A last demonstration that Anne didn't matter, that her body deserved no more consideration than a criminal's. The ladies in waiting looked around desperately for something to put Anne's remains in. Finally, they found an old elm arrow chest, a box that had been used to store arrows for the tower's garrison. It was roughly the right size, or at least closer than anything else available. They tried to fit Anne's body into the arrow chest. It didn't fit properly. Anne had been a small woman, but the chest was still too short. Her body wouldn't lie flat. So they had to manipulate her corpse, bending it, folding it, forcing it into a space that was never designed for human remains. Anne's head was placed in the chest next to her body, not in any dignified position. Just placed there, wedged in where it would fit. The lid was closed. The arrow chest containing the Queen of England's remains was carried into the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, located within the tower walls. There was no funeral service, no ceremony, no priest to bless the burial. Anne's body was taken into the chapel and buried in an unmarked grave beneath the floor. No headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate that a queen was buried there. She was put in the ground like a criminal, like trash, like something to be hidden and forgotten. The entire disposal process took less than an hour. By mid-morning on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had been executed, stuffed into an arrow chest, and buried in an unmarked grave. 17 days from arrest to death to burial. The speed was brutal. But here's the final twist that makes this horror complete. 11 days later, on May 30th, 1536, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. 11 days. Anne wasn't cold in her grave before Henry was remarried. The woman he had pursued for years had broken with Rome to marry, had crowned as his queen. She was replaced in less than 2 weeks. Henry showed no grief, no remorse, no second thoughts. He was relieved to be rid of Anne. She had failed to give him sons, had become politically inconvenient, had lost her charm in his eyes. So he had her killed and moved on to the next woman who might give him what he wanted. It was transactional, cold, utterly devoid of sentiment. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. The marriage was annulled retroactively, which created a bizarre legal situation. Anne was executed for adultery in a marriage that was declared never valid in the first place. The logical contradiction didn't matter. Henry wanted Anne dead, and Elizabeth bastardized, so that's what happened. The arrow chest burial became the final symbol of Anne Boleyn's fall. She had risen so high, become so powerful, influenced the course of English history so dramatically, and she ended stuffed into a box meant for arrows, buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. The descent from queen to discarded corpse took just 17 days. Years later, when the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was renovated, workers found bones beneath the floor. No markers, no identification, just scattered remains of various Tower prisoners. Among them were bones that likely belonged to Anne Boleyn, still in the approximate location where she had been hastily buried. In 1876, during Victorian restorations, investigators tried to identify the remains. They found a skeleton of a woman, small-framed, in the area where Anne should have been buried. The skeleton's proportions matched Anne's descriptions: small neck, slight build. The investigators concluded it was probably her. But there was something disturbing about the remains. The bones showed signs of having been broken and folded post-mortem. The arrow chest had been too small, so whoever buried Anne had to break her bones to make her fit. Even in death, Anne Boleyn was forced to conform to a space others had decided was sufficient. Even as a corpse, she was bent and broken to fit into the narrative Henry wanted. She was too inconvenient to properly bury, too dangerous to memorialize, too human to simply execute with dignity. The story of Anne Boleyn's final 17 days is a masterclass in how absolute power destroys people. Henry VIII had the authority to fabricate charges, torture confessions, rig trials, execute innocent men, murder his wife, and remarry within days. No one could stop him. The legal system, the church, the nobility, all of them participated in or enabled this judicial murder. 5 men died with Anne: George Boleyn, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton. 5 lives ended to support a narrative of Anne's promiscuity that existed only in Cromwell's imagination and Henry's wounded ego. 5 families destroyed, 5 sets of children left fatherless, all because a king wanted to replace his wife and needed legal cover for murder. The speed of Anne's destruction remains shocking, even 500 years later. 17 days from arrest to execution, no time to mount a real defense, no opportunity for public opinion to shift, no chance for anyone to question whether these charges were real. Just rapid, efficient elimination of a problem that Henry had decided needed solving. Anne Boleyn's final legacy is complicated. She was the mother of Elizabeth III, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. She influenced the Protestant Reformation in England. She changed royal marriage politics forever. But she's also remembered for how she died, stuffed into an arrow chest, buried without dignity, replaced within days. Her name used as a cautionary tale about women who rise too high and fall too fast. The arrow chest became a symbol, a reminder that in Tudor England, even queens were expendable. Even women who changed history could be discarded like trash when they stopped serving their purpose. Anne Boleyn went from the height of power to the depths of degradation in just over 2 weeks. And her husband, the man who claimed to have loved her, arranged every moment of her destruction without apparent regret. That's the real horror of Anne Boleyn's final 17 days. Not just the speed of her fall, not just the cruelty of her execution, but the casual ease with which she was erased. The arrow chest burial was the final statement. Anne Boleyn didn't matter enough for anyone to arrange a proper coffin. She was waste to be disposed of quickly and forgotten immediately. 500 years later, we remember her anyway. We remember the injustice, the cruelty, the speed of her destruction. We remember that Anne Boleyn died not because she was guilty, but because she was inconvenient. And we remember the arrow chest, the most grotesque symbol of how far a powerful man will go to erase the woman who failed him.